Rahu and Ketu in the Rashis. That's the very foundation of all your Rahu and Ketu experiences. What sign they're in. What sign they're in is going to indicate a very deeply embedded theme in the person's life. Now, Rahu and Ketu are also going to have a sort of similar effect in this, based on the houses they conjunct. But the theme and the issues based on the signs is the foundation theme, the foundation issue, that actually gives birth to the issues revolving around the houses. Okay? So what that means is, a person will actually work through their house issues with Rahu and Ketu first, and then they'll get down to the sign issues. The sign issues is a deeper, more root of the problem thing. It's more, we can say, chronic. And so it takes longer to get to that. Okay? But the foundation of all of our Rahu and Ketu experiences are going to be based on those signs that they're in. Now, Rahu and Ketu take about 18 months to move through one sign. So everyone that's born within a year-and-a-half period is going to have Rahu and Ketu in the same sign, which means they're going to have very similar evolutionary paths and goals to each other. So this is a very collective focus when we look at the signs. But that influence of the signs that Rahu and Ketu are in will differ dramatically based on the houses involved, okay? But we have to start by looking at the signs, always really, really core issues to the person. But they're usually going to be issues that they don't relate to that strongly until they've worked through the house issues. And then once they work through the house issues, then they see this whole new mountain in front of them. That is the sign issues of Rahu and Ketu. Okay? So, Ketu. One of the most important things and how we're going to sort of look at Ketu in this class here is that Ketu is always misting everything. One of his names was mist, right? So he's creating this mist. Now what this mist does, it creates his own little world. It's like your own personal Avalon. You're surrounded by the mist, nobody can see in, and you can't see out. And you've got your own little perfect world there. And everything you do in that little perfect world is right. That's Ketu. You're surrounded and hidden by that mist. And even though you're doing everything so well where Ketu is, because you're surrounded by mist, you don't get recognition and validation for it. And so you don't get fulfillment for it. You don't find happiness in it. You still feel cut off. Even though you're capable in that arena, you're still feeling cut off because you're cut off by that mist. And because of that, you have to journey out of the mist, which means you have to journey into Rahu. Okay? The other thing Ketu does is that Ketu, having that mist keeps you from seeing outside into the other possibilities. So say Ketu is so focused on the sign he's in, and the house he's in, of course, that he really can't focus on the possibilities that Rahu has to offer him. Not clearly. He might see glimpses through the mist. But to really clearly see the concrete possibilities, Ketu just can't do it. A person has to voyage into the unknown of Rahu before they do that. So this mist is affecting Ketu in two respects. It's giving him his own perfect world. And why is it perfect? Well, because it's really not measured against anything. If you're totally cut off by everything, if you're in your little hidden universe, it's a perfect universe because there's nothing to compare it against. Okay? So Ketu thinks in his mist that he's safe, secure, and perfect and happy, but he's not. And glimpses through the mist into Rahu show him that he's really not that happy, that he's got all kinds of issues and so on. Okay? And then, of course, he has a hard time seeing the potentials of Rahu, that opposite place, because he's surrounded by that mist. Now, Rahu, on the other hand, is dark. One of the names, or several of the names of Rahu just simply mean dark. So Rahu's dark. This is where you can't see anything. Okay? You only can imagine what's going on here. Just like when you're in the dark and walking through a dark house, you only can imagine that, where the stairs might be and where a table might be before you knock yourself against it. But you really don't know. But also, because it's the darkness, it's where there's the most potentials. It's like a void. Because there's nothing here, in a way, that's where you have the greatest potential. And you literally do have the greatest potential where Rahu is to discover new happiness, because it's a void, it's dark, there's nothing there. So anything you get there is going to be a new source of happiness, possibly, if you handle it right and don't let it destroy your life. So lots of possibilities where Rahu is. Now that darkness of Rahu creates a lack. That void is also an inner thing and creates a lack within. So whatever sign Rahu's in, a person's going to have a big void inside of themselves or a big lack. And that lack is going to result in a feeling of emptiness, a feeling of need, some type of psychological complex. A psychological complex is simply a behavior that we do because of something missing inwardly. Okay? Because of not having total self-fulfillment. And Rahu's sign and house and everything that it's in is going to indicate what type of complex we're going to develop because of a certain type of lack. So in every sign, Rahu is going to create a darkness, a lack, and out of that darkness, we're going to develop a complex, which means we're going to suffer. We're going to psychologically suffer, and that suffering is going to cause us to behave in a way in order to make up for that lack. And what's that called? That's called compensation. So Rahu in every sign is going to have a different compensatory action or behavior in order to try to make up for that lack. Okay? Now compensation, compensatory behavior, never makes up for the inner lack. Okay? So even though Rahu tries to compensate, he never finds fulfillment through that compensation. And as a result, he goes into a crisis. And that's the difficult part of Rahu. He makes us go into a state of crisis where we don't see clearly, we don't see rationally, where we behave where we behave irrationally, okay? And in extremes, that of course can indicate severe mental disorders. But usually it just means we do some things that just don't make sense, or we behave in ways that don't make sense, or we behave in ways that surprise us, or surprise other people. But there's a crisis stage of Rahu where a person breaks down and hits rock bottom because the compensations aren't creating the fulfillment they want to. And once that the person hits that rock bottom, there's nowhere else to go but inward and develop those strengths inwardly and abilities inwardly, and through that gain better balance. Now, as Rahu compensates, the compensations he makes are almost always somehow based on Ketu's qualities. Okay? So, he'll kind of fall back on Ketu, use some of Ketu's strengths to try to compensate. And then when he completely breaks down, he has to hold on to something, and at that point he also may bring about behaviors indicated by Ketu's placement. So these two guys are always sort of working side by side. Okay? Let me see if I explain that clearly enough. Let me look at my notes here. Okay, that's exactly what I wanted to say. So, when Rahu tries compensating here, he's going to compensate, but use some of Ketu's strengths to compensate. Okay? So these two are always working together. And again, that makes sense because we know originally Rahu and Ketu were one demon, one asura that got cut in half. So they're the same beast. They're just different ends of the same beast, which means they're the same thing. So anyway, when those compensations don't work to create the fulfillment, when Ketu tries to behave in a way to make himself seem more important than Rahu feels because of that emptiness, then they break down and Rahu has a complete and utter breakdown, which puts a person at their lowest point, at which point they need to really work through some serious issues. That's when they're sort of ready to really deal with the heavier stuff. As long as we think we can compensate, we're going to do that. And once we realize that doesn't work, then we can start getting more serious about fixing the problem, doing what we really have to do. And with Rahu, what really has to be done is the person has to have the strength and the perseverance to suffer what Rahu requires them to do, to suffer the humiliation that Rahu will require them to do, to deal with the discomfort that Rahu will require them to do, and basically to march ahead and concretely get their hands on what Rahu is trying to deal with and work on that thing. Now, as Rahu gets developed through that, simply through trial and error and perseverance and keeping at it, he kind of shows Ketu how Ketu was really not that great to begin with. How Ketu's little world surrounded by the mist had lots of problems in it. And then Ketu becomes aware of those, and then we achieve a greater balance between these two. And Rahu and Ketu are always sort of working on the same thing. They're the same beast and they're exactly opposite. And the law of opposites tells us that opposites at their extremes are the same. So when we take Ketu to an extreme degree of perfection, it's going to behave the same way that Rahu does at an extreme degree of perfection. Also, if we take Ketu at an extreme degree of, of imperfection and take Rahu to an extreme degree of imperfection, they're going to be similar. Okay? In fact, we even have a saying that Ketu is similar to Rahu. They're very, very similar. So, they're always working together. And the ultimate goal is Ketu. Ketu is the significator of liberation, completions, resolutions. So what Ketu really wants here, he wants to resolve the issues of the sign he's in. So in this chart, Ketu in Aries. But he can't because he's surrounded by his little misty universe. So he travels into the darkness of Rahu. The person to consciousness travels into the darkness of Rahu. Develops this opposite point of Ketu, which is the same as Ketu's point, because opposites are always the same when they're perfected. And through perfecting the Rahu's position, that has the effect of perfecting Ketu. And at that point, Ketu's ready for liberation. So it's a three-step process. A person goes through an introverted stage of personal breakdown when they realize their needs aren't being fulfilled based on Ketu's position. That helps them go into the unknown of Rahu's position, suffer through their psychological complexes, attempt to compensate, fail to compensate, break down, finally doing what they really have to do, both psychologically and materially, to master the sign of Rahu. And as they do that, they actually are mastering Ketu's position. And then Ketu can go on and give liberation. Okay? And in fact, the place where Ketu is really the first place that a person is going to have a true vision of God, of Spirit. Okay? Whatever house it is, a person will, sign or house it's in, a person will somehow approach God on that level. Okay? So it's a big process for all this to happen. Now, Rahu matures at 42. So that means from the age of 41 to 42, Rahu is maturing. And that's the period where really there's the most emphasis on developing that Rahu point in a person's life. Okay? Where they're really going to be the most capable of tackling that thing for the first time. Anytime before the age of 41, a person just doesn't have the ability to completely tackle Rahu's position. Okay? From 41 onwards, they're able to. And it's usually a 7-year journey because Ketu matures at 48. So between 47 and 48, Ketu finally gets mature. And so that's a huge period of growth for a person. Okay? But it starts with Rahu maturing at 42. And even after Rahu matures at 42, it's still 5 years away till 47 before Ketu really gets mature. That's because even after the person's really able to embrace the Rahu position at 42, it's still 5 years of working in that area and practicing in that area and really getting good at that area that before the person's really ready to take what they've learned and perfect Ketu with it. Okay? So it's a pretty serious process that happens with this Ketu and Rahu. And, you can just look at the effects and changes in most people's lives between the age of 41 and 48. Okay? It's almost like a new period in their whole life. Like a whole new person is sometimes born through that period. People regularly change jobs, change professions, change families, change their whole lives at that time more than any other time in their lives. And that's because those are the years during which Rahu and Ketu are maturing, and that can just really change their whole lives. Okay? Now, one of the real simple things to always remember about dealing with Rahu and Ketu is that the different elements of the signs, fire, earth, air, and water, represent different things. So fire represents self. Okay? Earth, well, let's go fire. Air is social energy. Okay? And they're always opposite. Fire is opposite air in every case. There's fire, air, air. So a fire sign is always opposite air sign. So self is always opposite social, or self is also always opposite society or other people. And so if we're striving for security with self, which is what Ketu is always trying to do, we really aren't secure as an individual, as a self, unless we're also equally secure amongst other people. And if a person thinks they're secure amongst other people, but then around other people feels insecure, they're really not secure as an individual. And anytime you see Ketu in a fire sign and Rahu in an air sign, you have some type of self-social issue going on, where the person thinks they're secure as an individual, but people show them they're not through the air sign. And so it's about them truly becoming secure through the help of society and people and relationships or whatever. Okay? Then, if a person thinks they're socially successful or socially secure, which Ketu in an air sign is trying to do, or thinks it's done, they're really not if they're not secure as an individual. If they just fit in as a empty face but don't have any individuality and self there, they're really not a secure person in that society. So, we're only as secure in our society, amongst our peers, with our relationships, as we are secure and successful as an individual, as a self. So that's what happens anytime you get Ketu in an air sign and Rahu in a fire sign. So anytime you see Ketu, Rahu in fire and air signs, you know right away the person's main challenge in life is dealing with self and social issues of some sort. Okay? Depending on the sign, we'll have a little difference there. Okay. Then we've also got earth Rasis, which are material, are always going to be opposite water Rasis, which are emotional. Okay, which are emotional. So, water and earth are always opposite each other. That's material security and material success opposite emotional security and emotional success. If we're materially secure, but emotionally a mess, we're really not going to be materially responsible or materially mature. You see it all the time. People who are emotionally irresponsible are always going to make a mess of their material life somehow, right? You know, they'll just have a bad day and walk out of work and quit because emotionally they're not mature enough. So, if a person thinks they're materially secure but they're not emotionally secure or emotionally well, then they're really not going to be materially secure when it comes down to it. And also, this is responsibility. If a person thinks they're materially responsible, but emotionally they're out of control, they're really not going to be materially responsible. Then, if a person's emotionally secure, water, like Ketu in a water element, or they're emotionally strong or emotionally healthy, then they're also going to be materially healthy. If they think they're emotionally strong, emotionally healthy, but they're having issues in their material life, it should show them that they're really not emotionally as centered as they think they are. So materiality and emotions always reflect off each other. Emotional responsibility, material responsibility will reflect off each other. If you see a person who's materially irresponsible, you know, without even talking to them, that they're emotionally irresponsible as well. Okay? So anytime we see Rahu and Ketu in earth and water signs, we got the striving for balance and development in emotional, material concern. Okay, so it's always going to be one of those issues, either self-social or material-emotional issues that Rahu and Ketu are focusing on in any given sign that they're in. Okay? Okay. Now, one thing I wanted to mention, as I mentioned, Rahu in a sign is going to give a lack, a complex, because of the darkness of Rahu. And also that darkness means something that they're unfamiliar with in the world, but also an inner unfamiliarity and therefore an inner lack. They're going to try to compensate for that lack, and they're going to use Ketu strengths to help them with that compensation. They're not going to succeed in that compensation. Reason being because Ketu strengths are really not perfectly developed. They're just strong in the context of that person's little immediate universe, not in the context of the entire world and the entire realm of living. And then Rahu is going to break down because it's not going to find happiness and satisfaction through the compensation. Okay? Now the breakdown point of Rahu in any sign, when that crisis point, that worst behavior of Rahu in any sign, is going to always be the same as in Rahu in the opposite sign. So whether a person has Rahu in Aries or Rahu in Libra, when it comes to being at their worst, hitting rock bottom, the behavior will be exactly the same. Because again, opposites at their extremes are the same. So when Rahu goes to an extreme of unsatisfaction and unhappiness, it's going to behave the same way as it does in Aries when it's at an extreme of dissatisfaction and unhappiness. Okay? So the good thing about that is that makes us have to learn a little less, because once we learn Rahu in Libra at its worst, we also know Rahu in Aries at its worst. Okay, so in your notes, your handout that you should have here too, and you should have printed out, I have some brief sentences for Rahu and Ketu in all the signs, in all the axes. Aries, Libra axis, Taurus, Scorpio axis, Gemini, Sag axis, Cancer, Cap axis, Leo, Aquarius axis, and Virgo, Pisces axis. That gives us 6 axes. So 6 very distinct developmentary focuses for every Rahu and Ketu position. And each of these 6 things has 2 possibilities, whether Ketu's in Pisces or Ketu's in Virgo. Will give some different possibilities. And in total, we get 12 possibilities, of course. But we're going to group them up based on the axes, because the issues are going to be so similar, whether Ketu's in Aries or Ketu's in Libra, that we really need to tackle them at the same time.